Hello, welcome to this podcast episode. We're going to talk a little bit about scales and perspectives on scales. I'm going to group this into parallel versus relative. And the big takeaway on this is to think about music and scales as something that can be dynamic and changing over time. If you play a tune and it stays in one key, you can really work with just one scale if you like. But even as the chords are changing, the consonances and dissonances will change depending on that. And then if you're playing a tune that does go through key changes, maybe use secondary dominance, things like that, then you're really going to have to use different collections of tones altogether. So let's say we have a 1, 6, 2, and a 5 in the key of C. When the chordal player is playing C major 7, the tones that are consonant in your melodic line will be the tones that the chordal player is playing. But they'll all have their own individual quality to it. So even the 7th here has a slight dissonance to it, right? But we can play in the key of C also over A minor or A minor 7. And then the tones that are consonant with that will change slightly, and you'll have dissonant notes that will also change slightly. Go to the 2 chord, same thing is going to apply, but we're on the same collection of notes. But each time the chord changes, the notes will have a different feel, a different relationship to the new chord. Okay, then we have G13. Okay, and in that case, we're going to have tones that will fit with that. Notice we haven't changed key at all, and we're simply playing with the key of no sharps and no flats. We're playing those same 7 tones. Now, when we look through this, or listen through this, or play through this, we have the 1 chord, and everything is relative to that, right? So we can use, the word Ionian and apply it to that. But we go to A minor, same collection of tones, but we're thinking relative to A minor. So we have Aeolian. So it can be helpful to think about this word because we're thinking specifically to the chord. But it's not necessary for us to think that we're going to some other place that's new. We're just going to the same thing, and we have different consonances and dissonances based on this chord. So same thing with D minor in this case. Okay. Okay, we have Dorian. Right? So that's how you can really start to get specific with individual chords and how a scale relates to that chord. So let's do one more, G7 or G13 here. And we might think, okay, G mixolydian. It's helpful to think about it in those terms so that you can think specifically to the G. But all of this, in a sense, is relative, right? Because we're playing from the same collection of tones, and we're looking at it from the perspective of different root notes that we're assigning based on the chord. Studying chord scales in a relative way like this is very helpful because tunes generally work in this diatonic manner where we have a collection of tones and we have chord progressions that work within those, basically using those same 7 tones. So I'd recommend, as you're working through chord scales in the key of C or whatever key you're working on, try to imagine the tonic tone as you're working through these chords and chord scales. Work at visualizing where on the guitar neck the tonic major tone is. So studying the chord scales from this relative perspective is really important, especially for understanding tonality and understanding tunes and having a starting point, because you may have a tune that's all within one key, but you may have a tune that goes and visits other keys as well. So you want to have a firm idea of where and what tones are in a particular key so that you know what's changed or what's different. Now let's talk a little bit about the parallel perspective. This is really important for understanding how chords operate and being aware that you can use tones from closely related keys, or you can use tones from different types of scales altogether. So I would recommend thinking about the parallel kind of perspective, which is to have one root note and go through different types of chord scales or modes from that root note. And you're doing this with the intention of getting a really in-depth look into how chords work and what chord scales are. This can also help you tremendously if you do work with modal music. So let's go back to C major. Right? So we have C major. We can play Ionian over that, right? We can have C major 7 and play Lydian over that. So that's from a closely related key, right? That would be from the key of 1 sharp. And whether or not you're aware of that is important, but try to start with understanding how everything relates to the root note. Okay, so what we've done here is kept the root note the same, and we've changed the mode or chord scale. So let's take something that's maybe a little bit different but related. Let's say we have the major 7 with a sharp 11, right? So now we know Lydian is compatible with that, or fits that. But we could also work with other types of chord scales on that. So we could say, we could play that, right? So then we just had a sharp 5. So what we want to know there is how each tone relates to this chord, and then work towards understanding what the parent scale of that might be. So in this case, that would be a melodic minor. Okay, so we commonly refer to these scales by one of the modes, basically. So a melodic minor, we would have a mode of that for C. So we could have a C with a raised 11 and a raised 5. So I'd recommend you try the different chord types, the basic chord types like major, dominant, minor, minor 7 flat 5, and fully diminished or diminished 7, I should say, and start exploring different ways to color in that particular sound. So let's take minor, for example. Let's say we have C minor. So I have no 7 in this. I'm just playing the triad. So we could play something very similar to major, but with a flat 3. And that's called melodic minor. Now in jazz, we generally use ascending melodic minor from the classical tradition, and we play those same notes, that same note collection in both directions. So, right. Whereas in classical, you would play basically natural minor going back down. So you can take a minor chord, C minor, and fill it in different ways. Something very similar, but with a flat 7. So you might think of that as Dorian, but sometimes you can simply think of it as minor. It depends on the context of what you're doing. So I'd like to offer this talk out to you to give you some perspectives on modes and scales and direct you in a good direction as far as what to practice and what perspectives you might choose to use on these relative and parallel types of thinking on chord scales. I hope you enjoyed this podcast. You can find the video version on YouTube at the Lessons and Talks membership area, and join our newsletter where you can find my course on foundational studies for the guitar and guitar patterns. We are also launching a new member site very soon. Get in touch with me if you're interested in checking that out. Have a great practice session.